Hi, and welcome to Hull & Hull TV. I'm Suzana Popovic-Montag, the managing partner of Hull & Hull, and I am very pleased to be joined here today by Laura Tamblyn Watts and Ian Hull. Laura is the fellow at the Institute of Aging at the University of Toronto, and she also teaches there, and Ian is the co-founding partner of Hull & Hull. Today we're going to continue a little bit of an interesting discussion, one of my favorite topics, and that is that of predatory marriages. Laura, when you're teaching at the University of Toronto and you've got a class full of students, what are some of the salacious stories that seem to arise when you talk about this really interesting topic?
They love to talk about predatory marriages. They love to talk about, the young thing that finds the old man, preferably with no kids, although, if you're going to strategize, having no kids is better. And they love to talk about the Anna Nicole Smith case in the U.S., where she went after a billionaire and ended up setting new law. So that's a great topic of conversation for them.
And Ian, how does it arise in your practice?
Well, I'm always hoping to have an Anna Nicole Smith moment myself, but I do want to spend some time talking about that case because it made some law, but it is a fun story as well. But yeah, at the end of the day, we will typically run into situations where they have children. And so whether it's male or female, the elderly individual is entering into a relationship of some excitement for them, but ruinously for the family. And so we will get approached on these kinds of cases from time to time. They are rare in terms of volume, but you deal with the whole question of capacity to marriage very differently than you deal with other issues of capacity. But the facts in and of itself are usually the first hour of the story because you're sitting there going, I can't believe this is happening.
Well, and the tests or the requirements for capacity to marriage are very, very low historically. It has always been one of the lowest possible requirements for the ability to understand and appreciate. It has a huge effect, not just a romantic effect, which is one thing, or a companionship effect, which could be another. But most folks don't realize it has a massive financial effect. And in lots of jurisdictions, it revokes your will, including this one. And so it may not be something that you could do in terms of having the ability to understand and appreciate making a new will, but you may still be able to marry, which has the effect of revoking the will. And so the implications are huge, and families really get into very difficult situations, I think, because it's both a financial concern and also a hugely emotional one.
Absolutely. And I think, this whole concept of elder abuse dovetails into this issue because one side of the family might be taking the position that it is essentially a type of elder abuse, that taking advantage of the vulnerable. But the Anna Nicole Smith coming to that, I think is worth spending a couple of minutes on because it's a case, as you say, it was a young, pretty woman who married a billionaire. And, of course, the billionaire's family, the first family, wasn't crazy about it. And the son was very intricately involved in a challenge to the relationship and the marriage itself. And developed some fascinating new law in terms of the tort of intentional interference of inheritance, and the whole idea of what are we going to do with predatory marriages when they can really question this with an unlimited budget. And so the lawyers did, and they went to town with it.
And Anna won, which I don't think a lot of people necessarily imagined. And it really, again, goes to this idea of independence and the sanctity of marriage and in this case, older person's right to choose. You do just need to understand and appreciate. Now, I think that there's room here to look at those historical tests and see if they're still as appropriate now in our context as they were when they were established. I think there's an area of law reform here, but the kids love talking about predatory marriages. One of the things that's also interesting, and you have to kind of push out, we have this idea that it's always going to be the young, pretty thing and the older man, and there's a lot of smiles that kind of go around that. But there's really often sort of two scenarios that we see that maybe are less talked about. The first is a gender piece. What if it's an older woman and a younger man? It's often more easy to challenge because there are gender roles of having this young man there that's more obviously a predatory piece. And I don't know about that. I think that it's interesting. why can't the older woman be just as foolish if she has the ability to understand and appreciate? But the other piece is that often people will look at, isn't that a good young man who's taking care of the woman, and isn't it nice that she has him there to keep safe and to fix things and so on? And so sometimes we'll look at those handymen and we'll think that, well, that's not really a problem because it's actually being very helpful. The other piece to that, though, is the very, I think, quite common scenario of a caregiver, often a live-in caregiver, who insinuates themselves into the lives, in this case it typically is an older man, and is isolating the older person increasingly, making them increasingly dependent, and then marries them, often with very little ceremony, and often without the family.
Yeah, you know, and I think it's funny, we like to sort of look at these issues today and sort of somehow that we're that much further advanced than we were 50 years ago. I mean, you know, there's reported cases. My dad was involved in a reported case. He acted for a gay individual who ended up marrying a woman, and it was absolutely as a result of the companionship. And they ended up winning, but you know, this was 35 years ago, and the social norms to that were completely brought around upside down. And a big part of the issue was, of course, there was a presumption that a woman in that situation would have been presumed to be taken advantage of. And so, I mean, I think we have to, you know, be sensitive to the fact that we, as a policy standpoint, you know, it's not right, I don't think, from my perspective, to get too deep into the question of capacity. And I think British Columbia has addressed it because they've taken the financial impact out of it, because it doesn't revoke the will. The marriage now doesn't revoke the will. And that way, by taking the financial, the sting of the financial impact of marriage out of it, I think in some part, anyway, in large part, has diminished the tension that can get created with these. And it's a simple law reform. It really is. As opposed to going to someone and saying, I'm going to take away your individual right to choose to get who you want to, whether you're married, and what marriage means for a 75 or an 85-year-old is very different than a 25-year-old. I don't know that we should be, be stepping into that debate, but we can lessen the burden by taking the financial impact out of it.
And building on what you're saying, Ian, another thing that British Columbia has that most other jurisdictions don't have, for good or for ill, is the ability to file a caveat. Yeah. So you can actually register a concern, a caveat, with the government to say that this person really doesn't have the capacity to marry, or if they have done, that it's being challenged. In a way, it's a little bit like putting a certificate of pending litigation on a real estate transaction. And, you know, there's good and bad in that. So one of the concerns is you don't want family members who are concerned about inheritance or other relationships, or just don't like the idea that mom and dad are getting married again, willy-nilly filing these caveats. But in some considerable issues, we see abuse being able to be stopped or at least unwound with the caveat on it.
And I think that's really so important, particularly, as you pointed out, the financial implications of these arrangements are oftentimes driving the family, whereas it's the emotional part of it that's driving the individual. That person who's happy that they have companionship because they love their family, but their family's not there every day. And so having that opportunity to, you know, not necessarily test, but to be able to make sure that this is exactly what the individual wants, I think is really important. And we're lucky that that is available in some jurisdictions, and probably something that many more should be looking at.
One of the things I think that we need to be more aware of in the immediate future is the issue of common law marriages being alleged. And increasingly with either the handyman in the basement or the caregiver, maybe from out of jurisdiction that's moved in, claims come after the fact that they were common law spouses. And a lot of people don't necessarily put together the opening up of common law relationships in terms of their legal rights. Ontario is behind that in some of the other jurisdictions. BC, for instance, is in a much different position. It's very easy to be assumed a common law spouse. And that if you are assumed, then you have all these rights and challenges that are available. So I think that we're going to see post-death, post-will, really dependence relief challenges on the basis of common law, and it will be very difficult to unwind.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a healthy reaction, though, to the fluid nature of relationships in our society. And I think it gets more unhealthy when we fall on, old legislation that is governing a pattern that doesn't exist anymore for the vast majority of relationships, adult relationships. So I hope Ontario are dinosaurs about legislation, but we keep learning from Alberta and BC and some of these forward, innovative thinking approaches to a difficult problem, and one that presumably will grow in volume as opposed to decrease.
Yeah, I think it is something that will have to be paid attention to sooner rather than later. Laura, Ian, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for joining us here at Hull and Hull TV.